Hello, everybody. I want to thank you, first of all, Professor, for this presentation. We are going to bring some general takeaways, some discussion points that we thought it was interesting from your text. So, the survival of the greenest. My name is Briana. Today I'm here with Martina and Florian. We are going to introduce the topic, but as you already mentioned, we have a lot of things to tell. Some takeaways from structural constraints, and finally some discussion points and questions. So when we start presenting the topic, I think one of the main questions that we ask ourselves, and you already presented, is why is low carbon industrialization is important for developing countries. As you mentioned, I will go really quickly. We have a high reliance on exports of commodities, and developing countries are really sensitive to climate conditions because of this. So already mentioning Prebisch as well, considering this, the climate vulnerability, we have a worsening of terms of trade. So it's going to impact hugely the source of export of these countries. And one of the main topics that I think was really interested about is that developing countries could take advantage of the cheap and clean energy sources, not only to decarbonize, but also to attract investments for a manufacturing sector. So before we start in how developing countries could take advantage and how they could do this low carbon industrialization, one of the main points that I thought was interesting is how you mentioned to understand who are the countries that were already taking advantage of this low carbon industrialization. And then analyzing different aspects of research and development, employment and export, we could understand that developed countries are already the ones that are taking advantage of this, mainly China, US, and Germany, so the results are really concentrated. Who are the ones that are creating more jobs in the green development, the green industrialization sectors? Where the patents are being originated from? Who are exporting this technology that we are using in this new sector? So why are the developing countries the ones that are not being able to keep up in this new sector? These are the main questions that we are going to take and use as base for our main takeaways. So I will start bringing the point of a paper from 2022 from Milley and from Teitelbaum that uses the productive capabilities to understand what is going to be demanded in this new green economy. So we know that green products have a higher PCI, that is the product complexity index, which means that rather than a non-green products, the green products demand more technology to be produced. Considering that, we also have the principle of relatedness. Based on the structure of a country of production, so based on your exports basket, you're going to be more or less probable to export certain products because it's easier for you to expand in something that you already have structure for than starting something completely new that you don't have the know-how and you don't have the structure. So based on that and connecting with the argument that the professor showed us, developed countries already have the structure, the know-how, and the technology to produce green products that developing countries do not have. And an empirical work from this same paper called Green Transition Navigator shows us and connects exactly these 2 points. So what are the green products? They use a compilation of APAC, OECD, and WTO to classify what green products would be, and measuring between these 2 methodologies, so the PCI, so the complexity demanded to produce these green products, the technology sophistication of it, and the proximity. So based on the current production structure of this country, how would be for the countries that I'm going to present later, Brazil and Germany, to produce the green products? It would be easier for Brazil or for Germany to produce. And they make this exercise that is really interesting, and you can see here. So we have the proximity, so analyzing the capability of a country to produce or not the green products and how complex this product would be. So considering that, you can see that Germany has much more capability and would be much more competitive producing any green product than Brazil. It's a really nice exercise you could do to any other country, and we are going to use this structural constraint to present other takeaways.
Hello, thank you, Amir. That was a cool presentation. And we, all 3 of us, agree that we need an active government to achieve any green goals we set. But there are a lot of structural constraints that you kind of hint of that in your last chapter, chapter 7, about kicking away the green ladder. And the argument here is that we cannot understand development related thing. We need to understand it in the context of the asymmetries that arise from international trade. So you mentioned also Prebisch and Latin American structuralism, and they are here mentioning the uneven economical exchange. If we go a bit further, we can kind of take some ideas or takeaways from ecological unequal exchange, meaning nowadays it's not only economically unequal, but it's also a flow of resources from low-income countries to high-income countries, while all of the environmental burdens are, of course, offshore. And there's this really cool article, and I'm putting the graph there, that proposes that nowadays how this materializes is through global value chains. So basically the argument here is that, as you say, global value chains can be an entering door into development path, and that's of course good. But what this author shows, and they build on 6 dimensions to show this, you have domestic ecological impact, GVC participation, productive development. The light blue line, it's developed countries, so we see that the more participation they've got, sorry, this is the mean from the whole sample. So developed countries have more global participation and of course less domestic ecological impact. And for us, Brazil and Argentina are in this red dot line, we have managed to kind of go into global value chains and gain some development out of it, but it has been at the cost of a lot of ecological degradation. So basically, what I'm trying to argue here is that the good development and green path the developed countries have followed rely on kind of pushing away the burden of the environment into developed countries. So that kind of raises the question of whether following this path is, as they say, compossible. So meaning something that is possible at a global scale.
Now, my 2 colleagues have already spoken a little bit about those structural constraints. And I will talk about a further constraint that is not given from the structure of the economy itself, but more imposed from global north countries. The CBAM, which was luckily not talked about before. So CBAM stands for the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, and that's a kind of CO2 tariff that the European Union implemented in 2023 to complement its emission trading. And the original rationale was that the European Union wants to put a carbon price on each industry, also on the emission-intensive and trade-exposed industry, or those ITE sectors. And they fear, okay, if we do this, then those ITE sectors will relocate to other parts of the world, which is called carbon leakage, or which will lead to carbon leakage because then the emissions are not taxed. And so this is bad for the European Union, and it's also bad from a perspective of climate protection. To combat this, the idea was we can apply the same CO2 price to our domestic and to the foreign producers and, so to say, level the playing field. The problem with this is that, peripheral countries from the global south, they are disproportionately affected. You can see this, for example, here from a publication by Timothée Beaufils in 2023. And in this map, you can see the share of domestic emissions that would be covered by a comprehensive European Union CBAM. And yeah, especially in Africa, there are some countries that have close trade relationships with Europe and would be hit quite hard by this, as has already been hinted to. Yeah, so there are certain problems facing peripheral countries through the CBAM. You may have export sectors that are highly emission intensive. Then as a developing country, you have your balance of payments constraints, you are actually export dependent, and also you have no sufficient finance to actually react to this price signal and to transform the production and shift to a greener production, because that's the original idea of CO2 prices, that you shift your production structure. And what is also often overlooked is that many developing countries have insufficient statistical capacities, or their firms have insufficient statistical capacities to actually detail to make a detailed assessment of the carbon price, and then like higher average values are used. So all in all, this leads to this allegation of pulling up the carbon ladder, and we can ask ourselves, is this even legal? What the European Union is doing there? Because there have been some legality and justice concerns about the CBAM. There have been countries filing WTO complaints. But actually the way the European Union is implementing it right now, it is consistent with the WTO because they are respecting this most favored nation principle, and they are putting like the same tariff or treating every country equally. But there's a tension in international law between this WTO law and the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change law of the most common but differentiated responsibilities principle. And the tension is that according to this principle, the industrialized countries with higher historic emissions would have a greater responsibility to tackle the climate change. But in fact, if the price level is the same for every country, then everyone has the same burden, and in effect, like the burden is even shifted to the developing countries. So you can see this as an example of those market-based policies where a carbon price has a regressive nature unless like the revenues are redistributed again, which they are currently not to like other countries from the European Union. Yes, and now we are moving to our discussion points. So like one potential solution presented by Professor Lebdioui was that biodiversity could be like a research and development resource for some of the developing countries. And there are traditional ways to profit economically from biodiversity, but they may be flawed. So the idea in chapter 5 of the book was to use like biodiversity as like an innovative development tool, to use nature as a source of information, to do like biomimicry, to help with drug development, and as inspiration for design and engineering. And this will also lead to my question. I want to question this because I'm a little bit skeptical of this. I think there's at one time still the danger of the extractive model. And then also, isn't this like an unrealistic assumption of leapfrogging, like skipping essentially the traditional industrial or manufacturing phase and going straight into like a service sector oriented research and development phase?
Okay, I'm going back to the solution you presented in the end of your presentation about the public policies, and quoting if I'm not wrong, in the 3rd chapter, you mentioned that in order for developing countries not to be left or even pushed behind, a radical policy shift would be necessary. So proactive public policies, industrial policies in particular that you presented also. And my question would be, okay, considering the Latin America historical experience that we had an attempt to substitute our imports, but then we have a huge collapse under the external financial pressure and the process of liberalization of our markets. So consider a scenario where, okay, developing countries are able to finance their green industrial process in their own currency through development banks in the best scenario possible. How to protect this new sector from international competition and from green protectionism? Is this even possible?
And lastly, and going back into whether we can or not be sustainable altogether, I now realize this makes me sound like I'm pushing away the blame of crappy governments in our countries, but I do think the external constraints are too much. And the way developed countries have actually reached the point to where they are now is by relying on an exploitation economically and environmentally from every other country in the world. So my question here is, given all of this situation, can we actually think of a model that is possible, so that it's not a zero-sum game where every country develops towards a green and more sustainable economy? Or do you think that's not really possible? Thank you so much.
Okay. So, Amir, I think you maybe we what? Yeah, we will just put the screen so that we can see Amir. Do you hear us?
No, I hear you perfectly. It was a fantastic presentation.
Try to put the where is the Zoom?
I think, however, that we can open up for questions because
Great. We
uh,
see. So maybe I can give you 5 to 10 minutes, not more, so that we can keep also debate with the other students.
I'm happy to open up for debate now and answer a lot of the questions after because the questions posed are interesting. I'm also keen to hear what the other students think. And the one where I want to particularly expand is on the value of bio-inspired innovation, the zero-sum game, and on the financing.
So you mean you prefer to take?
Yes, because when I start speaking, I can take the whole half hour. So this way I will restrain
I
myself.
can also stop you.
That's true.
Because that would be kind maybe for the discussion that you take maybe after 5 minutes. I tell you 5 minutes, so just be short, and then
Yeah,
we collect another set of questions, maybe better. So
sure. So this was a great presentation, I have to say. Uh, I will say a couple of things about the CBAM first. So one of the ways in which it has been justified is to say that it addresses, to be the devil's advocate, is that it's a carbon leakage mechanism, right? That is basically leveling the playing field because it's putting the same type of carbon tax that European producers have to face to international ones to enter the EU market. However, and they're also saying that if a developing country wants to use that tax to invest in greening, they could, right? And there would be a compensation mechanism. But the problem is one of a dynamic one and a selective one. Dynamic one because the country that you've shown in the map, they're even more stuck between the rock and a hard place because they're losing their export market. They have to green fast, but the investment is not coming fast enough to be able to prepare, right, for that shift. And two, the Europeans were very sneaky because it's the list of products that is actually included in the phase-in, right, in the first phase of the CBAM. And they've actually excluded all the products that are exported from the US to the EU, intentionally so. Because they thought that if the CBAM damages the US, they will face trade retaliation. The funny part is they faced retaliation anyways because of the Trump administration. But as a result, those are actually the most hurt are the ones that have less market power, right, to respond. So that's in the way that is really unfair. The CBAM itself is not bad. It's the way you do it. And these kind of discussions on carbon border mechanisms, they should be taken to the multilateral level, not imposed by one government and one institution on another. Biomimicry, you make a very good point, right? Is it scalable as a service? I am a strong defender of biomimicry for two reasons. One, scalability. The current model of bioinnovation and bioeconomy in many developing countries tends to often translates into a biologicalization of extractivism. You extract that molecule, you extract that, the Brazilians here, I'm sure they love acai. Acai has gone very popular for breakfast bowls in Europe. But acai is actually a very impressive fruit because if you extract the chemical compounds of acai through an ultra pressure machinery, the chemical compounds that you get become more valuable in terms of value to weight ratio, more valuable than gold. So it's been great for pharma, cosmetics industry, natura. But the problem is, as it becomes valuable, you need to grow more and more acai, right? So that leads to deforestation very often. Biomimicry, you can scale without ecological pressure because what you're extracting from nature is just information, inspiration. So as a development model, it becomes very interesting. You can leapfrog in terms of the R&D phase because a lot of a lot of green techs are actually inspired by nature, right? So you're closer to the source of inspiration and it's very aligned with the technological frontier. We talked about data centers, right, being the next barrier or glass ceiling for AI uptake because of their energy intensity. Guess what is the most data intensive structure in the world? To give you an order of comparison, the most data intensive hard drives are the Sega hard drives. There is a structure that is 1 million times more data intensive than that. Can you guess what it is?
DNA.
It is the DNA. So now with synthetic DNA, there is fantastic results this year. But that's one example amongst many. So in terms of jobs, so jobs will be created. The one point that I take is who will capture those jobs in developing countries and biodiverse regions. It's unlikely that you'll manage to get local communities, indigenous communities to really benefit from it. But you can put in the strong legal frameworks to at least have benefit sharing. And we actually launched an initiative last month called the Nature's Intelligence Studio that is based between Oxford and Belém. It was launched at COP30 that will actually generate those intellectual property frameworks for local communities involved in conservation to get a benefit from the innovations that derive from bio-inspired innovation, along with ideaton capacity building, so that they actually join that biomimicry field. The last one on financing, I think you're correct. A lot of that investment, it shouldn't be driven by foreign direct investment, and it shouldn't be driven by donors. Developing countries should get their act together to development banks to actually fund some of those things that are not necessarily profitable. And money exists, actually. There are many different ways to leverage it. Development banks in Africa, there are quite a few. They're very small, but there's also a regional one that could have a lot more market shaping power, right, to promote catalytic investments with patient capital. But you don't even see that happening. And yes, maybe it's not enough, but even that part is something that we don't see enough of. So I think the responsibility is shared. But the current debate where you still want to get private foreign investors to fund these kind of things are not meant to be profitable. And you have to do an overly revert to de-risking, by the way, de-risking doesn't exist. There's only risk transfer, but you can't remove risk. So you're removing risk from BlackRock to basically taxpayers in developing countries. So there is a shared responsibility, and if we had an international financing architecture that actually insured properly countries against risk, they could do things that are a bit more bolder when it comes to development finance. But in the absence of a fair financial infrastructure, many developing countries have to prioritize fiscal stabilization in the short term as opposed to investments for long-term transformation. Maybe I'll end there so we leave time for questions.
Thanks. So
But thank you for the presentation. It was excellent.
Thank you for the amazing presentation of the discussant, and also you too, Professor. I want to be I am from Thailand, okay, and I want to be an evil advocate for a bit, because I want to ask, why do you say the risk of status quo is higher? Because like for some country, investing in green technology or industrial policy is even riskier, because we also have other structural problems, and a lot of our political parties are focusing on the more acute problems than solving global warming, and the parties that solving global warming are not gaining traction also. So I want to hear your thought on why you say the risk of status quo is high even for a country like this in the global south.
Hello, I'm Luisa from Brazil. I wanted to know, what do you think about the fact that when we're talking about China, we are usually, depending on the discussion, we will put them into developed countries or in developing country. But I think in this discussion in renewable energy technology, their big difference is how the government is capable of enforcing what the policies that they do. So they developed a lot in the last 20 years. They had this 5 years plans, so basically 4 to 5 years plans, and they are extremely, I don't know, they just have like a very big structured plan, and they are very demandful, and if the companies that they are sponsoring are not following what they promise, and the government has, how do you call it, ideas of what they want to reach in, for example, I don't know, 2-3 years, and if the companies don't deliver, they basically stab the companies. And I think this is a major factor that differentiates between other developing countries other than China. I want to know, what do you think about it?
Hello, Professor. Thank you for the presentation. So I have a question regarding the industrial policy is traditionally framed around manufacturing because of its high linkages or increasing returns or knowledge-intensive processes and so on. But can we meaningfully design industrial policy from a service sector perspective? I know that you have discussed about this in the book in the last chapter a bit, but I would like to know a bit more about it. And if so, if you are building a service-oriented industrial policy, how should it look like? Thank you.
Last one, and then we'll have a second round.
Okay, hello, I'm Hannah from Austria. And in your book, you mentioned at one point that neoclassical and the degrowth schools are focusing too much on consumption. So my question is a bit, I didn't really heard it today or in your book, and what is your view of the hard ecological limits that we actually face for further industrial expansions? And if you could kind of accept or see a point of some sort of selective degrowth in rich countries for luxury industries, which have to complement kind of the green industrial transformation.
Thank you. Amir, I give you the floor for this first set of questions.
You didn't warn me that your students had tough questions. These are very, very good questions. So I will start in reverse order. First thing is on the ecological limits. They're very clear. There's one thing that I think the degrowth school does badly, is that they also have that neoclassical emphasis on consumption, and very often on individual consumption, with much less to say about the transformation of productive structures that is needed, especially with the co-benefits that link to the political agenda, right, of greening. Because at the end of the day, you see the rise of populism. You see that people care about affordability. So we need also a narrative that is able to be aspirational, right? Not in terms of reducing people's consumption only, but actually in terms of changing it towards a better quality of life, which some of them go into this, but it's a bit unclear. The one thing that they do really well is actually shedding light on the material footprint, right? And I think that's a great benefit, because when you see the green industrial policy in many ways has focused too much on emissions and not as much on basically carbon footprint and not as much on our material footprint, right? Which is equally, important in the context of ecological sustainability. So with actually some colleagues, we started this research on industrial policy with less waste. When you compare basically durability, the economics of durability, the economics of circularity, and the economics of demand reduction for different products based on innovation and smart design. So I think in that front, you get a place where you're able to produce within planetary limits with a green industrial policy, but it's not so much about just reducing demand for products or changing consumption. It's much more of a productive issue. By the way, you know who funded the work on measuring carbon footprints individually? But they also funded the work, the first environmental campaign about the effects of air travel and emissions is British Petroleum. Because the whole idea to put individual responsibility and individual consumption responsibility, there's a long history behind, which is to shed attention away from those that are polluting to basically saying that every consumer could do something at their own small space. The truth is, you'll need action from everyone. There was a question about from our friend from Thailand about the risk of not doing it. Well, it's very clear because in some countries the situation is fiscally unsustainable, right? Thailand might be a different case, but even then, if you're producing carbon-intensive goods at the moment, and you know that, and agricultural products are highly exposed to climate change, and so if you do nothing in 20 years, right, you have two scenarios. One where you lose a lot of your productivity to climate change, one where the world has managed to decarbonize and you're not able to sell your product because it's too carbon intensive and there are too many carbon taxes around. So you actually have to steer market forces in a new direction. The problem is if you leave it to market forces alone, there's no guarantee that they'll do it in time. And there's no guarantee that they'll do it in a way that has maximum social spillovers, right? With local linkages, with jobs, which provides that political platform to sustain your agenda. Again, people need jobs, right? People need things that are affordable. And that's where the state can actually deliver in terms of the directionality of this agenda. And yes, there are risks involved. You might choose the wrong sectors. But again, if you don't do it, you know that you're going to have the wrong sector, right? Because that's the one that you currently have. That leads to the question on sectors. I totally agree. And I used to believe that the good industrial policy was about your ability to choose the right type of sectors, but I changed my mind. Because if you look at history, especially the Chinese example, which is formidable, you realize that it's not about picking the right sector. It's about that unique capacity to adjust, to adapt, to change the sectoral focus based on different market conditions. So we need to put less focus on the specific technology, but actually on the linkages that you build so you can keep adapting and changing the types of technologies that you emphasize with your green industrial policy. And that has to be a whole of society discussion because the decisions on what you produce, where you produce, how you produce, they change the social fabric of society. If you're in Brazil or Mexico, if you put a factory in the north, which is actually already high income, if you put it in the south in Chiapas, which is actually low income, it has huge implications in terms of national cohesion, in terms of inequality, in terms of the impact on criminality as well. So these decisions need to be taken through consultative approaches and not just by bureaucrats sitting in a ministry.
Hello, I am Alina from Argentina, and my way of thinking is really related with the last question of Martina. So basically, I don't see way out with this like more European parameters. So I want to think more in your evolutionary economics perspective. So the example that you said that, okay, if you want to fix your phone here, you cannot do it, but if you go to Latin America, they are going to fix it. And I was thinking that now in Sri Lanka, there was like experienced like a terrible flood, and the ways in which people organize themselves to deal with the effect of this extreme cases that is related also with climate change, for me was amazing, and it shows like a lot of innovation in a scope that of course is not like taking into account with patents. So in that sense, maybe I can think in a bit of hope, thinking in the resilience of the capacity of adapt of the global south in this like more dystopic, utopic future. So maybe if you can give me more, something more in this like evolutionary framework.
Mm-hmm.
Hello, Amir. Thanks for the presentation. I'm Leo, also from Brazil. So you did manage to convince me quite a lot, but I still would like to ask probably an annoying type of question. The other day I was seeing this...
No annoying questions. There are no such things as annoying questions.
I was seeing this interview with Aurélien Barraud, who is a French astrophysician, but also writes about ecology. And he was saying imagine we are in a scenario where we dispose of this green energy, who is completely renewable, that is completely renewable. But for him, in such scenario, it would actually be the worst case scenario, because it's not about how, it's not about not having energy, but actually about how we use this energy. So, and then he makes the point of this would only allow for more destruction, in a way. And in the end of your book, you also touch on these, like saying how in an economy we have also to talk about more about purpose, and if the brightest minds are all pointed towards answering the quantitative questions instead of the hard existential questions. So I guess I would like to hear you talk more about these, and also if we have to pay attention to the projects that we as economists interact and work with in the green initiatives, to not just say to us, okay, we are working with this green project, but I guess they are not all the same. So yeah.
Hi, thanks a lot for the presentation. My name is Nicolau, I'm from Spain. And I was, just on what Hannah asked about degrowth. I mean, I wanted to make a quick comment, and maybe if you can maybe also clarify, because, I mean, for me, I'm not the biggest degrower, but I have the feeling that they don't focus on consumption. I mean, like, I think, or only in consumption, of course. I mean, they have like this kind of like green socialism, and there is a lot of like social transformation that goes along degrowth, and also like a lot of switching like production structures toward like more like labor intensive and less like energy intensive work. So, I mean, I don't see your criticism towards the growth. Maybe you can just like expand a bit more on that. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Sophie. I'm from Belgium. I had a quick question. At first, you did the example of the island. I don't remember. Renault Island. I was quite interested in the perspective that you have on like in rural economies, which are very much dependent, like in Renault. And so I was wondering what are the other perspectives you have in their transition. Thank you.
One more, and then I give you the floor.
Yeah, I'm Luis from Germany. My question would be in the direction of working conditions, and class perspectives, because so far we talked a lot about inequality, but only in a spatial sense. So where industrial sectors are changed, but we have huge effects of inequality when it comes to the change of industry, especially in Germany. This is a very large topic right now. Working conditions in the car industry under Tesla are way, way worse than all other working conditions, and they especially use employing people from different migration backgrounds to weaken the position of labor. There's no labor organization in Tesla factories. They really built on this American type of firing people quickly. And I mean, if the state does industrial policy, the state has to treat the labor side as more than just human capital. We need to also address working conditions and income and what distributional effects we have from green industrial policy, and I'm kind of missing this so far.
Amir, floor is yours.
Thank you. Another set of fantastic questions. I wish I was with you in person. Again, going in reverse, the inequality dimension is extremely important, not just between countries, but within countries as well. This is mentioned and touched upon in the book. But this is also a matter of, the good industrial policy will be a socially inclusive industrial policy, because that's the way that you buy time for your agenda, right? That it gets continued, that it becomes a societal endeavor. I think there are great lessons to learn from, for example, the Inflation Reduction Act. So the green industrial policy that the US has promoted because the way it looked like was basically essentially tax handouts to large corporations, right? In terms of the instruments that they used. He was basically telling all the manufacturers, invest in a factory in Texas, in Mississippi, in Alabama, and you don't have to pay taxes for 20 years, right? If you produce semiconductors and if you produce chips and solar cells and wind turbines in the US. But for workers, it didn't make a big difference, right? I don't know if you've kind of followed some of the indicators, but with the election last year, in terms of unemployment, it was a record low. But the problem is if you're a worker, you didn't really see your wage go up that much. So they didn't use those incentives, those carrots, as a way to also provide sticks to say you will get those benefits, but you need to make sure that the working conditions need to improve. You need to make sure that workers have that much paid holidays per year. And that was the moment where you could do such thing because you have political capital to do it. And they haven't. And look at the results. Increased exposure to populism, right? Because people feel that their lifestyle hasn't changed. The corporations are getting richer, recording record profits, but for workers, it didn't make a difference. Mexico is a very interesting case to compare because the minimum wage actually has doubled in Mexico in the last 5 years and is continuing to increase. The devil is still out there in terms of, the jury is still out there in terms of what will be the effects, but you can definitely see different dynamics in terms of industrialization is supposed to help, workers if you want that agenda to continue. In Mexico is with a caveat because there is also an correction since the industrialization model was historically based on exploitation of cheap labor for assembling activities, the maquiladora model. So yes, you're absolutely right. If you want your green industrial policy to be successful long term, it needs to be with social cohesion. There was a question about degrowth. So I stick to my criticism on the focus on consumption. I mean, it's in the name, right? Degrowth. When it comes to growth, when you focus on GDP, GDP is a measure of consumption. It's not a measure of productivity. It's not a measure of structural transformation. It's not a measure of well-being. And I know many degrowthers say that it's not really about GDP reduction, it's about going beyond GDP, which is fine. But I think one thing that needs to be recognized from an intellectual point of view is that degrowth is a movement with very different types of views and advocates and types of authors, right? With some similarities and some contradictions. It's like Marxism. You can have like 100 economists who identify as Marxist, but they say very different things. So on that sense, I think in the critique, I think beyond the emphasis on consumption, I think the political one is more important. Because the challenge is so huge that you really need this to happen in practice. And I think that from a political standpoint, I don't see a politician successfully winning a campaign with degrowth narrative. You need to sell something aspirational. And it might be just semantics, but semantics matter. I have recently published this interview with the British Venezuelan scholar Carlota Perez. If you don't know her, please read her. She's a wonderful woman. She's 87. Her life has gone through all sorts of revolutions. She was a Marxist guerrilla fighter in Venezuela. She went to jail. She was exiled in Maoist China. Then she turned into a capitalist. She advised IBM. Then she turned to a scholar. And she basically pioneered this idea of technological revolutions, right? And in this interview, she talks about degrowth. She talks about how to move towards a green golden age. And it's targeted towards young people. So I recommend that you read it. It's published in Development and Change. The point of the interview, her argument, which I agree with, is to say that the challenge, if you kind of reduce it's perfect is the enemy of good. And if you really want to promote the green golden age, you need everyone on board, including finance, which is a very difficult task because at the moment, finance is oriented towards short-term profit maximization. But if you look at towards history, it's the moments where you're able to align, right, the win-wins, that you can actually make great leaps. So today, the challenge is really towards getting that right, including on the kind of green development narrative, the aspirational life, as opposed to really focusing on reducing our individual consumption and collective consumption, which will be an outcome of this aspirational mandate. And I think someone was mentioning about the links between Nauru and other African nations. Is that right?
Between?
Our friend from Belgium was asking to compare Nauru with cases, but I didn't hear the name of the countries.
Wait, I give her the mic, otherwise you won't hear anything.
Yeah, I was mentioning other insular economies who are also as much dependent as Nauru. I was just wondering if you have any perspective around that, because I mean, yeah.
You said insular economies.
Yeah, insular economy.
You know what they say about small island states? They're not just small island states, they're big ocean states. And in a way, they're often framed in terms of the vulnerabilities that they face, which is absolutely true. We're doing some work in the Caribbean with the CARICOM, the Association of Caribbean States, towards building a regional industrial policy. Because alone, they're just too small, right, to be able to do any meaningful dent. But then to link back to one of the presenters, this is where tradable services are your best friend, right? Because if you're an insular economy, you have very high transaction costs for the transportation of physical goods, and you don't have the space. But tradable services, right, enable you to export your products at scale without having to move physical things. Unfortunately, historically, for many insular states, that has led to tax havens and financial services. That's the most tradable, service, high value, but often linked to criminal activities. But now there is a need to do better, right? And I think for those states, the situation is particularly difficult because of their exposure to climate risks. So yeah, they're facing a particularly difficult situation, but alone they won't go very far. This is where regional coordination is really essential to maximize collective gains.
Hi, I'm Andrea from Mexico too. Since I heard that you're really familiar with Mexican case, I want to do my thesis on try to see how we can keep fostering the digital transition in Mexico, but also factoring the environmental footprint. But I have the sense that our high dependency on the US in foreign direct investment and our exports, and also their politics decisions have a huge impact on what type of decisions we can make. So I wanted to know your opinion on if it's actually practical that right now, given the current geopolitical context, we can invest and foster a digital transition that accounts for the environmental footprints or not, because I was feeling no, but maybe you have a different answer.
If I got your answer correctly, it's about the proximity to the US, but also the data transition, you said.
Yes. Hi, Theo from Germany. I must say that I really disagree with your statements on degrowth, because it's not really focused on consumption, and it's also not in the name. It says even if you take degrowth, it can be applied both to the consumption side and to the production side. And I think that the degrowth movement has one of the most comprehensive frameworks in order to address the ecological problem, which is to move towards a more planned economy within the framework of planetary boundaries. So my question was also going more towards this side, because there's now this a variety of scholars that argue that the transition towards a green economy will be much more like a war economy, kind of. So the role of economic planning will be more and more important in the future. And yeah, I wanted to ask you whether this industrial policy requires so much coordination throughout the broad economy, which also includes the education system and many different sectors and ministries. So why do you think that it's not a contradiction between a market economy that based decision making a lot on autonomous and automized actors instead of like having a comprehensive planning throughout the entire economy?
Thanks. Yes. No other question. No, you can.
Hello. And related to Andrea's question on Mexico, I think her question was related to the viability in the geopolitical space. So many times Latin America has tried to put forward environmental or industrial policies, and whenever economic measures didn't suffice, there was like a threat or even action military from the US, in particular for us. So in that scenario, it feels like, or you adapt to whatever the US or China, in the case of Vietnam and Thailand, say, or you kind of,
And there is a short follow-up.
No, it was just a forgotten question from before, actually. But we can move on. It's just the question about what are we allowing with a green transition, the more existential type of question, and like if we should engage with this type of green projects, and what's your opinion about this?
From an evolutionary point of view, or? Sorry, can you repeat the question?
No, I said it was a forgotten question about like what the discussion about what are we allowing with a green transition being necessarily good or not, because like more energy also means the continuation of destruction, and like and your point about purpose behind economics in the end of the book.
The very last forgotten question.
No, my forgotten question was about hope, adaptation, and evolutionary point of view.
Superb. That's a good way to end it, actually. Not forgotten, pushed back.
Okay, it's your turn.
Okay, no, many excellent points again and questions. So one is, okay, well, this is a discussion that we should continue, or you should all continue at the pub. But for degrowth, I stick again to my ground. It is in the name, right? Degrowth, GDP is focused on consumption, right? And again, you have many different types of degrowth literature. But again, the whole point is transformation of productive structures as I see it. Now, I have an advice, or unsolicited advice, something for discussion. In the process of change, right? We can all really change the world. I'm convinced. I'm very optimistic. But we need to know exactly what we're up against. And there is the world as we hope it was. And there is the world as it is, and as we have it. And there is an unsung virtue here of marginal reforms, where sometimes we'd rather kind of change the system to how we think would work better. And I can tell you from a policy point of view, very often it's the worst cases of dramatic failure. And there is actually thinking about what actions lead to better consequences. Like if you want to bring down capitalism, there is, I agree with the direction, but there's a whole different discussion about whether this can be done in the time scale that we need, right? In terms of the ecological transition. So when it comes to planning, for example, I completely agree that we need much better planning institutions. We need states to actually take control of financial markets to deliver for people and not the current situation. So again, when it comes to degrowth, there is a balance to have, with I think that nuance is often lost. But the fact of focusing on consumption, right? It's a fact. It is in the name, and if you focus on GDP as a level of measure and reducing it, it is focused on consumption as opposed to productive structures. Two, there were comments about Mexico. and the broader geopolitical alignment. I think that's very important because that relates to the first point. You can have the best wishful thinking. You can do the best policy of what works for you. But again, you're up against very, very strong incumbents. You're up against very strong counter forces, right? That have a wide range in their toolbox, right, to prevent you from competing or doing something against their interest. This is not conspiracy theory. This is history, right? And countries have gone from tariffs, trade measures, to all the way the Latin American classmates that you have would know something about it. Maybe they're too young, but to regime change. What we're seeing nowadays is a very tame version of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, where if you had a socialist government in place, you would be, the chances that you get overtaken by a CIA-backed coup are very high. I mean, the Chileans, the Guatemalans would have something to share about this. So in that context, Mexico is very close to the US, but there's great lessons to learn from other regions, especially Asia, and specifically ASEAN. Thailand is a member state of the ASEAN Coordinating Council. And there is a concept, which is the concept of the kanchil, that is present in Malay folklore, that has guided, your friend from Thailand knows the kanchil. In Malay folklore, the kanchil is a small mouse that manages to beat the larger animals, the elephants, by pitting them against one another and skillfully navigating between them. And so there is in ASEAN diplomacy the idea that you are a kanchil. So you're stuck between China and the US, and you essentially thrive by being strategically non-aligned. And strategically non-aligning means that they're not pitting one side or another, but even economically, they're making sure that it's always balanced. In Malaysia, it's state policy. If you receive a strong investment from China, from Huawei in telecommunications, they actually make sure that they're leaving some of the market share for a Western company because they always want to be perceived as being on edge. And that's how they're managing to get investments from both sides, right? And I think that skillful navigation is something that Mexico hasn't yet achieved, and not least because it's overly dependent on the United States, right? So when Mexico started to receive recently investments for EV, battery and electric bus manufacturing in Mexico from Chinese companies, they faced threats of trade retaliations from the US because this was a way that Chinese company could access the US market. So moving forward, I think that balance will be key. But frankly, I think that your current government, is trying to manage those relationships as much as they can. And frankly, they seem quite successful. So the counterfactual matters. Other countries are having much harsher conditions. The last point about, I think there was a point on evolutionary economics and the green project. I just want to end on one thing, which is evolutionary thinking. We have to do better, right? And I think, again, narratives matter, which is my issue with degrowth in the narrative that it promotes. We are facing a crisis that is existential. We know what we have to do, but we haven't managed to align interests, right, to make it happen. Now, evolutionary economics, I still stand by it in terms of not only some of the animal analogies that I used, but also how we relate to our own kind of survival and adaptation as a species. I want to end perhaps with a final analogy. So to help us fight climate change, individual intelligence and artificial intelligence won't be enough, right? What we need is more collective intelligence. It's really that coordination amongst everyone, amongst all our actions to meet optimal outcome. Now, if you seek inspiration from nature, there is one species that is particularly brilliant as a form of collective intelligence. Can you guess which one it is? They don't have high individual intelligence, but very high collective intelligence. If you guess, I'd be seriously impressed with your group.
Trees, bees, wolf, mushrooms.
It's ants. Because ants, before me. Did she say it? No. So ants are incredible at getting organized, right? Incredible. If you look at all the role that they play, if someone was asking about planning, they're the best planning you can get, right? But when an ant colony has to move from one point to the other, they move the whole colony in a very structured, disciplined way. It's like a little battalion, rows by rows. But for any reason, if the front row spots the last row, they instinctively follow it. And you can look online in YouTube. This is called spirals of death, because they just keep going in circles until the complete exhaustion of the colony and then the death of all the ants of the colony. So if you look at where we are today, the way that humans are behaving with our productive system is very much like the death spiral. We know what we're doing is harmful for us, but you keep doing it. So I encourage you all, as individuals, as research communities, as student communities, to keep being like the ant that breaks free of the spiral, thinking of what we have to do from an evolutionary perspective. This is evolution. This is not just a nature-oriented, this is not just an ecological act. It's actually the way that we will evolve our productive systems. And breaking free of mainstream thinking is one way to try to promote new ideas. So this will be more for your generation to solve than ours. And in that context, I wish you good luck.
Thank you very much, Amir.